The MFA in Writing and Publishing Program's Friday night reading series. We feature a lot of our faculty and visiting editors, agents, and writers in the series. We're based here at the Vermont College of Fine Arts in Montpelier, Vermont, and we are the residential program that's here on campus, traditionally from September through May every year, but because of COVID, we're doing all of this remotely. So thank you for joining in via Zoom. This is really great to see everyone's face and so many guests here. And so we are going to have a wonderful lineup of writers and agents who are going to be reading with us tonight. So for every writer or agent, we have a graduate student who typically introduces our visiting guests, and I'll actually be introducing one of our guests as well. So let me just give you a little bit in terms of the order of the program for this evening. So Philip Shackleton, who is a graduate student in our program, a second year rising into third year, will be introducing Miciah Gault, who is a fiction faculty member in our program, and we're very excited about that. I will actually be introducing one of my former professors, and I'm so excited to have him here, Shawn Wong, who's joining us from Seattle and the University of Washington. And Eli Jacobs will be introducing our three literary agents from Folio Literary Management tonight. So tonight we have Jeff Kleinman, who's coming in place of Rachel Ekstrom. So thank you so much, Jeff. Thanks for joining us. Sonali, Chanchani, and Katherine Odom-Tomchin. So they will be our three literary agents and representatives from Folio Literary Management. After they do their section where they'll talk and do a small presentation, we will have a Q&A for the Folio agents themselves, and then we're going to open it up for a Q&A for all of our writers and guests. So please do, stick around for that. I think it'll be really interesting. And yeah, and if you're joining us just now, just please be sure to mute your microphone. And if you don't want your video recorded for any reason, either throughout the reading or during the Q&A, feel free to mute your video as well. So that is the program for this evening. I will make an announcement, and so will Shini, that you can get the books from our featured authors, tonight through places like Bookshop. We'll be putting the links up, so please do support our featured authors for this evening. And at the end of our reading tonight, I'll give you some more information about our reading on December 4th, which will also be on Zoom, and will feature authors like Bianca Stone and Kun Woon, Jasmine Darsenic, and Jenny Wortman. So I hope you come back for that. That also will be from 5:30 to 7:30 Eastern time on December 4th. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our graduate student, Philip Shackleton, who will be introducing Miciah Gault.
Hello, am I being heard okay? Okay. Miciah Gault is a graduate student, graduate of the prestigious program, MFA program in Syracuse. She served as the editor of Hunger Mountain for 9 years. Her fiction and essays have appeared in numerous periodicals and anthologies, including Tin House, Electric Literature, Salon, and the Harvard Review. Miciah is the author of the novel Goodnight Stranger, which is a finalist for the Shirley Jackson Award and first fiction prize in Poets Writers. It is also longlisted for the prestigious Center for Fiction's first novel prize. I had a chance to read this book when I came home from Vermont. I highly recommend it. And this is what George Saunders said, is somewhere the ghosts of Shirley Jackson and Henry James of the turn of the screw are smiling because of a wildly talented young writer has joined her lineage. Using an alluring combination of literary and genre techniques to tell a story of choices, regrets, and courage and loneliness, the novel features the excellent prose and precise sentence level writing that I found. She's very good at helping students identify and develop her own writing after taking her sentence module last fall. At VFC, Miciah is also a very good resource for students when we face the inevitably difficult choices of how to balance our professional writing lives when we leave graduate school. As a teacher and reader, I find her very good at giving a balance of constructive criticism while reinforcing our strengths, which is something I and many others respond to very well. I look forward to working with her in the coming months on my thesis and reading more and experiencing more of her work. So.
Thank you, Philip. That was so nice. Yes, thank you for talking about my book, Goodnight Stranger. But I decided, I got inspired. We've just finished this amazing sentence clinic module with the students that I loved so much. And we were doing writing exercises, and the students were writing new work and sharing it every day. And just kind of like working with Philip and Darla and thinking about, that rush of creating new work and sharing it. I was like, it is time. I have been reading from Goodnight Stranger for over a year now, and it's time to read something new. So I'm going to read a little bit from my new novel. I've never read anything from it before. So, I feel a little scared. And as I was like, we've been doing this. So our sentence clinic class, we run it like a workshop, parts of it, but we workshop just one sentence. So we'll spend 20, 30 minutes workshopping one sentence all together as a class. So we're really deep in the like word choice and the marriage of words. So of course, as I was like practicing reading it out loud earlier, I was like, oh, cut that one. Can cut that phrase. I don't need that. So I feel like I'm like just revising still. So this book is, it's a draft isn't finished, but I see it all, a lot of it's finished and I see the rest of it. It takes place in 4 decades when the main character Dinah is 15, 25, 35, and 45. And so it was a little bit hard for me to pick which decade I wanted to choose from to read. I love the ones where she's 15. She lives in rural Vermont. She has this very kind of, she joins this sort of group of vigilantes, teenagers, and, that are kind of doing their thing, enforcing rules, setting rules of their own in her town. It was a really exciting part, but I decided, and then I also love the part where she's 35 because she has a baby. It's just this whole other part of life. She's, and she goes back home. But I decided that it's just a tiny little section when she's 25 that I thought I would read from. It just seemed kind of contained. I also liked it because we did, James Scott and I did a talk on obsession for writers recently, a couple of weeks ago. And we were talking about our obsessions, sort of both large and small. And I mentioned one of my obsessions is pockets. And so this just showed one little way that I am working pockets into the novel. So anyway, you'll see Dinah in this finds sort of 3 objects that then go on to be important clues throughout the rest of the novel. So that's all I'll say. You can listen for what you think those are. Okay. I don't even know what the title of the novel is, so no title. You just have to go with it. In those days, one snowstorm could render the city soft as a body. Bodies were different then. At least her body was, as she scurried past the park and headed up 4th Street, kicking snow with every step. Powder, confectioner, sugar. She was 25, shivering, and probably, possibly, definitely in love. Love made her hurry. Love made her catch her breath. She watched the foolish snow ghosts rising up around her feet. Everything is lovely when you're in love. The young, overripe beauty of summer and winter's elderly gloss. Oh, well, she was spinning like a top. She was a carnival. Minutes until she saw him again. She pulled her collar around her throat. Snowflakes settled on her hair. They were going to Balanchine's Nutcracker at Lincoln Center, which felt like a grown-up thing to do and also delightfully childlike. It was exactly what a grown-up woman might take her daughter to see on Christmas Eve, but here she was, not quite the grown-up woman and not quite the child, or somehow both at once. Her dress was black, and so was her coat, so she looked like a dark shadow moving through the newly white world. Snowflakes made their way inside her collar and melted on her bare shoulders. She was wearing lace underwear, stockings, and garters, and her thighs were freezing, but it was worth it because after the ballet in his apartment, he would discover the garters and be at her mercy. She could already feel that future moment, tiny explosion. Maybe this was the night she'd been preparing for all her life. She was ready for love. She was ready to conquer and submit, to be generous and greedy. His address was written on a tiny square of paper and folded in the pocket of her coat, but she didn't need to look at it. She memorized it. 250 Mercer, number H8. Snow fell all around on her black dress, her bare shoulders. The old doorman was an ogre of a man, huge and stooped, with a terrible scar on his chin, who grunted when he held the door. Because she was in love, she felt only tenderness for the ugliest of doormen. He buzzed the apartment, heard the answering buzz, and grunted again to indicate she should go up. The buzz had the sound of a large creature in a small cage, something needing rescue. Her reflection in the gold doors of the elevator surprised her. How much she resembled a lady from an old photograph, sepia-toned, and with that peculiar expression the women in old photos so often carried, as if their thoughts were entirely elsewhere, a dream, another life, another world. The door of H8 was ajar. "Hello?" she called into the apartment. Inside was still as night, quiet too, except for the expensive hiss of expensive lights. The door opened into the kitchen, a tidy space with gleaming faucets and stovetop. How in the world did he afford an apartment like this? The countertop was not the gray or white granite of home, but a jet black gleaming slab. He must be house sitting or borrowing the place. "It's me," she called. Down the hallway in the living room, she found a pale couch and chair and a shelving unit made of glass with 3 potted plants on each shelf. Eggshell walls, white flowers in a vase, a white rug as lush and thick as moss. "Are you here?" she called, and stood awkwardly by the window, waiting, but he didn't appear. Outside, the snow had softened the edges of curbs and dumpsters and newspaper vending machines. By now, Dinah was feeling uneasy. Her stomach tilted as if she'd swallowed something bad, not liquid or comestible, but combustible. Some knowledge coiled in her intestines like a long fuse. "Rex," she said. "Damn it." The single bedroom was empty, the bed with its white spread as tidy and smooth as snow. The bathroom also was empty, clean, not even a comb or toothbrush lying around. Did anyone actually live here? In the bedroom, she yanked open a drawer and found nothing. In the closet, a single button-down shirt hung, but there was something wrong with it. Okay, the pocket had been cut out, a neat square snipped away entirely, a little window. Had Rex forgotten their plan tonight? Well, he'd just buzzed her into the apartment, so he'd been here moments before. And back in the kitchen, she found the tickets to the Nutcracker lying on the glossy counter. She picked them up. If Rex were a different person, she'd be merely mystified right now. But Rex was Rex, and so she felt frightened. A rock dropped in her belly, rippling out to her extremities. Waves and waves and echoes and echoes. She began looking carefully for evidence that might support her fear. It was hard to find anything useful in an apartment like this, which seemed more like a showroom than a home. The trash cans were empty, the medicine cabinet behind the bathroom mirror also empty, the shelves not merely vacant, but wiped clean, dustless. Inside the fridge, she saw a quart of orange juice and a takeout container, which proved to be pad thai. The orange juice seemed right. Rex was a fan of orange juice, and she was flooded by memories like a deck of Polaroids of Rex with various cartons of juice. She unfolded the square of paper and looked at his handwriting. It was definitely the right apartment, H8, plus here were the Nutcracker tickets. The ballet started at 8 p.m., and it was already 6:20. They would skip the restaurant, eat the leftover pad thai, and arrive on time, or skip the ballet entirely and stay in, but she already knew none of it would happen. Her entire body felt stiff and awkward now. The garters and stockings. Jesus Christ, she had embarrassed herself thoroughly. It had been so easy to call back the old rush of excitement, the wanting. Had he planned this whole night just so he could leave her alone in the apartment, ridiculous and confused? She took his pad thai out of the fridge and ate it from the carton. She drank his orange juice from the carton. She would go to the ballet without him. It was almost 7 now. She could catch a cab to Lincoln Center and be done with Rex again. On her way through the living room to the bathroom, she saw 2 things that she'd missed before. The first, a set of ceramic ghosts, one black and one white. They were the only decorations on a table meant for the TV alone. One had a whimsical, surprised expression. They stood out because whimsy wasn't a word one associated with Rex, and there was so little else in the apartment. Dinah picked up the little ghosts and shook them. They were salt and pepper shakers. She sprinkled a little into her hands. This made no sense. Rex was not the kind of person to store something meant for the kitchen in the living room. Yet here they'd stood beside the TV as if staring out into the room, watching all that had happened, one with its mouth open in a circle of surprise. Then she saw, on the white rug near the leg of the glass-top coffee table, a tiny wet spill, a red blossom the size of a dime. Was it blood? It was a bright, cheerful color, which meant new. She felt a fresh wave of fear. What in the world had happened here? Had Rex cut himself and left the apartment to get help, to borrow a bandage? Something was wrong, she knew now, the way you know you're thirsty or tired, that physical conviction. Blood rushed to her head. She kneeled beside the white rug, static in her ears, head full of bees. The blood was the color of trillium, rotten-smelling woods beauty of her childhood, and for a moment she saw herself as if from above, dress spread around her, a blossom herself, blooming, thriving, impossibly. In the apartment hallway, on the dark-colored floor, she found 3 more spatters of blood, spaced evenly. On her hands and knees now, she scoured for the next drop of blood, a treasure hunt. She was rewarded in the bedroom near the window by 5 drops, all close together, all in a line, like a path, an arrow. Had he done this on purpose? Was he directing her somewhere? This was just like Rex. The little line of blood pointed to the bedroom window. The sill felt warm when she lay her palm on it, the glass cold. Outside, a narrow courtyard, and beyond that, another building, brick and window, a mirror image. She stood and looked. At once, a light clicked on across the way. Every light was for her, and every window. Across the way, a figure appeared at that window. Half hidden, she tried to gauge the height of him. Then he raised one hand as if waving to her. The light clicked off. Come back. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you.
That was so good, Miciah. Thank you so much. Thank you. Yeah, so after every reading, feel free if you want to unmute for a second and clap, applause, that would be amazing. So thank you. So I will introduce our second reader for tonight. It is my honor to introduce Shawn Wong, who is an incredible novelist, essayist, and professor. Shawn is the author of the novels Home Base and American Knees and has edited anthologies such as IE, an anthology of Asian American writers, Asian diasporas, cultures, identities, representations, and the Before Columbus Foundation Fiction Anthology. And his awards include the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Association Award, National Endowment for the Arts Creative Writing Fellowship, and the Rockefeller Foundation Residency in Italy. 14 years ago, Shawn Wong was my professor at the University of Washington, where I completed my MFA in creative writing. As a professor, he was witty, insightful, caring, and provocative. In 2006, his novel American Knees, which follows the Chinese-American Raymond Ding as he falls in and out of love with Aurora Crane, a Hapa journalist, before finding a fulfilling romance with a Vietnamese-American woman, lots of spoilers there, was being adapted into a feature-length film by Aaron Byler. With candor and warmth, Shawn shared with us what it was like to create a narrative for the page and the screen that centered the contemporary polyphonic Asian American experience. In his novel, Shawn was not afraid to push at the boundaries that separated Asian American communities and to depict Asian American characters as complicated agents of their lives. The film adaptation of American Knees premiered at the South by Southwest Film Festival in 2006 and won the Audience Award for Best Narrative Feature and a special jury prize for Outstanding Ensemble Cast. But perhaps Shawn Wong is best known, along with Jeffrey Paul Chan, Fran Chin, and Lawson Fusayo Inada, for being an Asian American canon breaker, as Hua Su described him last year in The New Yorker. In the 1970s, Chan, Chen, Inada, and Wong founded the Combined Asian American Resources Project in order to preserve the literary history that they were piecing together. And in 1974, they published IE, an anthology of Asian American writers through Howard University Press. In the preface to the anthology, Wong and his fellow editors wrote, Asian America, so long ignored and forcibly excluded from creative participation in American culture, is wounded, sad, angry, swearing, and wondering, and this is his IE. This sound was more than a whine, shout, or scream. It is 50 years of our whole voice. This unified Asian American voice and anthology laid a solid but provocative foundation for a generation of Asian American writers who came after them. Sue writes, students and activists in California invented the term Asian American in the late 60s, inspired by Black Power and similar movements among Native Americans and Chicanos, and those involved in Third World liberation. And Wong and his editors of IE ultimately emphasized what connected different Asian immigrant communities and their struggles: efforts to resist gentrification and alleviate poverty, the anti-war movement, stereotypes about Asians as passive or perpetually foreign. The term implied a set of shared historical conditions. Where to go next was an open question. Shawn's groundbreaking work in IE has continued to be a source of inspiration to me. And as a fellow Asian American writer, I have often looked to his work to see how one can navigate the complexities of the matrix-like Asian American experience, introduce new kinds of narratives about America to the page, and figure out how Asian Americans of different ethnic backgrounds could finally learn to talk to one another. As a pivotal writer and provocateur, Shawn Wong continues to be cutting edge in his writing. He's currently working on a novel entitled The Ancient and Occupied Heart of Greg Lee. The novel centers on the story of Greg Lee, a professor of historical linguistics who has to make the transition from academia to the world of retail women's clothing and fashion after his wife Anne dies of cancer. He takes leave from his work as an expert on the history of writing and ancient and dead languages to operate his wife's retail business as a way of keeping her memory alive, working through his grief and believing he needs to pay penance. He follows Anne's path in business as if he were an ancient merchant following a trade route. Along his journey, he brings the myths and stories of the ancient world as lessons for learning the new world of business and fashion. He lands on what he describes as an island of women, where he is not permitted to leave until he learns how to acquire a voice that will help him survive in a world where he is required to speak to women, to dress them, to love them, to ask them for forgiveness, safety, and protection. That's a really wonderful premise for a novel that we need now more than ever. So please help me in welcoming Shawn Wong.
Thank you. Thank you for that amazing introduction. I learned stuff about myself I'd forgotten. Thank you, Rita. I'm going to read from the novel that I've been working on in this space here behind me. I think I'm on my 6th revision of the novel. I'm going to read just 2 sections. One from the very beginning of the book and one towards the very end. And hopefully it'll be somewhat seamless. I don't need to describe the novel since Rita just did that for me. The name of the main character's wife is Anne. And as Rita mentioned, I don't know why novelists do this to themselves. You know, they pick a subject that they know nothing about, which in this case is the history of language and writing, the 3,000-year history of writing. And so I had to learn that because my main character does historical linguistics, and I knew nothing about it. So whenever I ran into somebody who did that, I used them like human Google. And one of those persons is sitting behind Rita, who I met in Munich and invited myself to his office to look at dead scrolls, Sanskrit scrolls. I like the humility of learning a language and going through the chronology of speaking like a child, having adults correct me, and finally having enough fluency to tell an impromptu joke to a barista or give directions to a stranger. Or I spoke like a textbook, having no regional tones or accent or bias, no north or south, no dialectical origins. In the early stages of learning with a limited vocabulary, I learned different ways of communicating the same thing by listening to people on the street or describing the object without knowing the name for it. Or I was taught the name of something in the local dialect. I could tell my students to be quiet and say silencio, or in regional descriptive idiom like staimanzo, be an ox, or as quiet as one. I knew how to say I didn't understand in several languages. When my students and I traveled by train through Italy and I held the one group ticket, I taught them to say to the conductor, Il uomo cinese ha il mio biglietto. The Chinese man has my ticket. At various times, I was both known and anonymous. I started a journal to keep track of the untruths my wife told me and the untruths I told her. Next to the fiction she created about our life together, I noted how I supported those untruths with fictions of my own, or I noted my denial rather than voice them aloud. The act of writing down those untrue statements gave them permanence and visibility. It was the kind of untruth that couples engage in. Some as simple as what if, as in, what if we had met earlier? What if you took that other job? What if you had married that other woman instead of me? The other untruths had some truth to them, as in, if we had that baby, she would be 7. If you hadn't married your first wife, I wouldn't have met you. If you hadn't gotten divorced, you wouldn't have married me. And the third category contained the untruths about the possibility of things that could be true. Her stories were not simple declarative statements, rather whole episodic narratives that defined a timeline where their 2 lives were lived separately, then parallel, then joined. The true parts of her story were what we shared, and the fictional parts were how she told my story before her, before we met, and how I would live my life after her, when the language they spoke to each other would become extinct. That's your profession, she would say to me. Dead languages. It was meant to be accusatory. I was irrelevant, teaching an irrelevant subject to students seeking some sort of elite knowledge, not applicable to anything in the modern world. She doesn't drive a car and has never used a computer. I occupy that same blank side of her knowledge. Women ask her what I do, and she would sometimes say that I'm a professor of antiquities, as if to suggest that I would be an expert on PBS's Antiques Roadshow. These were the stories my wife told me more than any other, the possibility of things that could exist in the space between us, in the past or in the future. Jealousy might be the kind of emotion that fell into this category, but her statements were so much more complex than simple jealousy. They were not dependent on the chronology of our life together, or of our collective memory, or of any kind of loyalty to a shared history. She wanted to know how something was true or untrue felt when she said it aloud, or when I heard the untruth from her. It wasn't the facts that needed to be accurate, rather the emotion. The duration of that feeling, the momentary silence between us, was what she toyed with. And following the pause, she offered various scenarios and corruptions of the same fiction. Anne said one day that I had a good immune system. She was speaking on 2 levels. The one we acknowledged about my good health compared to hers, and the other, which we did not speak about, and was the true meaning of her comment about how I voluntarily suppressed speaking about certain things. She took the suppression of those things to be untold revelations, incomplete stories, ignorance of the obvious, or simply secrets I kept. And the more they remained unspoken and ignored, the more they became a kind of myth, or a kind of spoken story that changed with each retelling. She wanted me to say those words aloud, even though the beginning of the story might be true and the ending was not. She wanted to hear a word or phrase I never used before. Would that new phrase or word signal a lie? Was its origin from a text I had read or from someone else's lips. Sometimes I would imagine book burning as an act of charity or forgiveness on her part. When women were only a linguistic image in your world of theory and ancient worlds, they were lifeless, and their lives were simply an interpretation or guess as to the real lived experience. Once you take possession of their world, their bodies, both real and imagined, there's always room for the inadvertent lie. You say something to a woman in a language you haven't quite mastered, and it's something not true about yourself. I am 6 feet tall. It's easier than saying 5 feet 11. From there, you can say you've traveled here on a ship instead of a plane. Say, yes, you've been to Budapest, though you haven't in the same way you lie about having read a book. You lie because you don't have the vocabulary for accuracy. You misstate your desire for something you order, or you order the wrong food for dinner and pretend it was not a mistake. Then you say it doesn't matter, even though the phrase you used isn't her language. She understands that it does matter and corrects your mistake. Or she whispers something in your ear and you don't know what she's saying, but it's a whisper. And you guess at the meaning because her hand touches your forearm for emphasis. You agree to something you don't understand, but its context is desire. She orders something you've never tasted. She books travel on a train for the next day. She feeds you and makes you repeat in her language the name of the thing on your tongue. You point to something on a plate and tell her you don't eat that, even though you've never tasted it. She tells you what it is, then corrects you when you try to say it by putting her thumb and forefinger between your lips to open your mouth while you speak. In her language, you need to speak with your lips. Her fingers at your lips are the missing vowels. You tell her that her dress is pretty in her language. A simple word you know. You subvert and deny your own vocabulary in her presence. Sometimes you repeat a sentence twice as if you're learning the language from a recording, or you say the phrase and the translation at the same time as if she can't understand her own language. The dress is pretty. Instead of being the destination, she's the transition from this place where empires end to the next. It's like the gentle rocking of a boat you feel after you've disembarked. Your body's muscle memory is working to find a balance. Your equilibrium, your center of gravity is what you want. The next thing in your life is nothing ancient at all. It's not a place at all, but a person or an object of food that's new. You step into a store in Berlin that only sells licorice, and another that only sells red and pink polka dot dresses. In Rome, there's a barber who cuts the hair of children as they sit on wooden carousel horses, a store that repairs porcelain dolls, a shoemaker in Florence that has your foot in a wooden form. You wish a marriage had these separate and distinct rooms. Each new place has its own language. In the non-ancient world, grief feels specific and targeted and is fed by your knowledge that one person died rather than in the ancient world where grief is measured by the end of an empire. It is then you see yourself for who you are, even though you embrace anonymity. A customer, a visitor, a tourist, a passenger in transit. You fit a pattern. Each new word seems like an encroachment on the walled city where you keep the two of you, you and Anne. But you allow others to enter even though it seems against your will. When you cross into another country or another marriage with a different language, a woman hands you the dress she's wearing. Even if you did speak the language, she's now speaking in her regional dialect. She teaches you whichever word is easier for you to pronounce. Did you use the right word, right verb to exit the train or to light the train? You hold her waist for balance. Sometimes she makes you pronounce a word without telling you the meaning, then adds another and another and another until you say something she wants you to say to her. After you've mastered it, she takes your hand and places it on things you said. Tablecloth, teacup, sugar bowl, lips, throat, breast, all feminine nouns. She's only translated the nouns and not the verbs, so you don't know what she wants you to do. You know the name for it is declarative learning. She's been in the sun all day, and when you pull your hand back, it has her fragrance, and declarative language becomes episodic memory because it's now in the past. When you leave the classroom, it's all episodic memory. You're unable to decipher the language of those who are living because they only speak and never write. You are a merchant traveling east and west, following the paths of soldiers who create empires and destroy empires. There's a dress silhouette called empire. You come from a country where there are no walled cities and enter another where there are gates and portals and bridges. Though no one stands guard anymore, you look for them as if you were asking permission to enter. The conversation then must expand outward away from how you imagined your voice. You put a lamp and a dress on the floor with a chair in a corner. You say the words for those objects because you know them to be the correct and true words. It's an anonymous dress until she lifts it from the floor, slips it on in the dark, and turns on the light. The body fills the volume of the dress. The dress frames the person inside. The light fills the volume of the room. Thank you.
Shawn, thank you so much for giving us a preview of what you're working on. Our next student introducer tonight is Eli Jacobs. Eli is a Maryland-based writer, poet, and first-year graduate student. Eli will be introducing the three agents who are representing Folio Literary Management.
Hello, everyone. Folio Literary Management is a full-service literary management company dedicated to providing authors and literary estates with comprehensive representation and career management. They represent more than 1,000 authors, placing their works with publishers throughout the US and around the world. Their authors in fiction and nonfiction have been New York Times bestsellers, to Nobel and Pulitzer Prize winners, to winners of the Newbery, Caldecott, Edgar, Penn New England, Penn Faulkner, and James Beard Awards, to celebrities. They have also established a major footprint in the field of children's and young adult publishing with Folio Junior, a list devoted to picture books in middle grade and young adult fiction. In 2018, Folio acquired Harold Ober Associates, a legacy New York City literary agency representing some of the most iconic writers of the 20th century. Founded in 1929, Harold Ober Associates played a vital role in the careers of such literary legends as Agatha Christie, William Faulkner, James Herriot, J.D. Salinger, Langston Hughes, Pearl S. Bucket, Richard Adams, Willis Lowry, and many others. Ober authors have seen their works adapted into major motion pictures like Mary Poppins, Rosemary's Baby, and Rebel Without a Cause. These agents have been kind enough to, over the last several weeks, to teach a module for students here at VCFA, graciously offering us valuable insight into the job of a literary agent and the inner workings of the publishing industry. Sonali Chanchani began her career with an internship at Kaya, an independent press dedicated to publishing authors from the Asian diaspora. She joined Folio as an assistant in 2015 and is now building her own list, focusing on literary and upmarket fiction and narrative nonfiction. Across the board, she's drawn to character-driven stories and is especially keen to work with underrepresented voices. Katherine Odom-Tomchin, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, is Folio's audio rights manager and former writer, editor, and traffic coordinator at Heritage Publishing Incorporated, a publisher for attorneys, tourists, seniors, and healthcare professionals throughout Florida and Southeast Georgia. She consistently places the agency's audio rights with the most effective audio publishers possible and acts as a sub-agent for Ben Bella, an independent publishing house based in Dallas, Texas. She joined Folio in 2017 as a literary assistant and was now actively building her own list. Jeff Kleinman is a literary agent, intellectual property attorney, and founding partner of Folio Literary Management. He's a graduate of Case Western Reserve University, the University of Chicago, and the University of Virginia. As an agent, Jeff feels privileged to have the chance to learn an incredibly credible variety of new subjects, meet an extraordinary range of people, and feel at the end of the day that he's helped build something. A wonderful book, perhaps, or an author's career. His authors include the New York Times bestsellers, The Art of Racing in the Rain, Garth Stein, The $80 Champion, Elizabeth Letts, The Snow Child, a Pulitzer finalist, Ewan Ivey, Widow of the South, Robert Hicks, and Mockingbird, Charles Shields, among other books. In addition to his commitment to contemporary voices, Jeff is a custodian of the Story Literary Agency Harold Ober Associates. He upholds their legacy, representing iconic titles such as Rosemary's Baby and Watership Down.
I'm not sure how we're supposed to do this, so I guess each of us is going to talk for a few minutes. Is that the plan, Rita? You want us to do that? So they're going to force me to go first. So I'm Jeff, and I don't know about all the stuff that Eli was saying, but I'll believe it, I guess. So there's no way we can ask questions as we go because we're all going to talk about different things. You don't want to do that, right, Rita?
So yeah, Jeff, if you want to, ask questions to the audience or open up a space for the audience to ask questions for you, we can combine the Q&A with your presentation. That's no problem.
Well, I think we're each supposed to talk for like 5 to 7 minutes, and I'll talk for like 3 or 4, and then people can ask questions, and then I can maybe answer that. So they're forcing me to talk about the state of publishing right now. And so I was going to talk briefly about that. And I guess the big thing that I would like you all to take away, normally, well, it's sort of a double-edged sword, but normally you talk about how tough it is to get into trade publishing. And I think it's never been tougher. And I also think the book industry's actually never been as vibrant, despite a lot of, despite the pandemic and all this tough stuff happening in the world, people are continuing to read, and stories are continuing to sell, and people are continuing to be hungry to hear that. So I think you should keep that in mind and take that away as sort of a real positive. That said, publishers are being a little more careful than they were. Well, they're always careful because the profit margins are so low, but they're very much trying to not just buy kind of willy-nilly. They're really trying to focus and target the books, but when they're excited about something, they get very excited. So that's part one I want to make sure that is clear. The thing that I think is also really useful and interesting, especially for this kind of a group, is they're really excited about voices. They're excited about new, fresh voices, distinctive voices, and Sonali will talk more about that. But just make it clear that they're not looking for kind of the same stuff that they've seen before. And so you guys hopefully are writing, I think we can see from Shawn and Miciah how different their voices were and how distinctive they were. And that has never been as, people really love that kind of stuff. So it's kind of cool. The one part that is, I think, useful to talk about is, although the book industry has pretty much stayed static, it went down right after COVID, but otherwise the sales are pretty much like the same as they were last year, which is kind of surprising. The problem is that it's hard to get to bookstores. So there's a lot more sales for ebooks than there were from bookstores. So the worry is what publishers have been doing is giving, basically sending books to independents to keep them going. And independents may not be able to pay them back. And so the worry is if the independents start going under, going bankrupt, then all of a sudden the bigger publishers are going to take this major hit. But at the moment, everybody's really trying to work together with things, and they're working with libraries and bookstores to really make sure books are available and get them out there. So I think that's also kind of positive. So the one area, and then I'll kind of open up to questions. And if you don't have any questions, then we can just keep right on going. sorry, I was reading comments to see if I miss anything so far, is that I think the one area that's harder is stuff that you've seen before. Things I think of as sort of the standard canon. When you think of books that were published in the 50s and 60s and 70s, they were often dominated by white men. And they're, certainly very valid, useful things that people are saying. They're as valid today as they were then. But I think there's a little less interest in the publishing world to read about that kind of subject. They're more interested in what Sonali and Katherine talk about with these diverse voices, with things we haven't seen before, with voices and perspectives that maybe were ignored or discounted, just weren't paid as much attention to. And I think that's sort of the new place that I think everyone's sort of looking for. So I hope you all are planning on sort of, if you do come from a background that is less sort of from the standard canon, I think publishers have never been as open as they are now. And Sonali can talk more about that. So that's all I really have to say. So unless we have questions, we can just go on to the next person. But if anybody has questions, you can welcome to ask them. Cool. Okay. Erin. Hey, Erin. Nice to see you.
Jeff, it's so nice to see you. I feel like we'll get into this when other people talk, but I guess my question for you, and it's something I struggle with when I talk about stuff with my students, is does that stress you out? That it's a little bit harder for the typical narrative to get the attention it used to get? Or does that feel like a healthy corrective because that narrative used to get the attention it didn't really deserve for so long? My thinking, and as an editor of a journal, not of a press, is that for a long time, we were not questioning our own aesthetics, and we were just sort of celebrating what had already been celebrated. And it was really easy to just sort of read work that confirmed kind of what we had seen before and being like, yes, that's good. And that right now, what we're doing as publishers is trying to look at work on its own terms and see like, what might be good that I haven't understood before or consumed before, been excited about before. So I'm really excited about the diverse voices that are emerging. And I know that, Sonali and Katherine will talk more about this, but like, I don't want my white cis het students who are male to feel like their voices are being discounted, because I don't think that's what's happening at all. I think what's happening is like, you need to do something new, just like everyone before you has always had to do something new. So I don't know if you want to say a little bit more before we shift over to your buddies.
No, I totally agree. And like, so it doesn't make me nervous, but if I'm reading something that feels familiar, it's more easy to discount it. So, you see something that I got a novel in the other day about a middle-aged guy who's getting divorced and he's having an affair. And the guy's a very well-published novelist. And Philip's leaving. He hated it that much. Crap. And I just couldn't imagine knowing what to do with it because it didn't feel like he did anything new. He didn't feel like he trod new ground. And so I think the problem a lot of times you find is voices that have been more represented can get resentful because they feel like, well, what's wrong with my voice? It's been fine before. But on the other side of the coin, isn't that what we're all looking for? Is, you got to keep going. So I totally agree. Nina, you had a question.
Yeah, my question is sort of like related to, so at the beginning of the year, there was that whole controversy with American Dirt, which was sort of, toned up, but she got a 7-figure book deal. And I was wondering how much that disparity still exists, do you think, where a person of color who's trying to tell maybe their narrative, those narratives are still sometimes pushed aside in favor of, and whereas, someone who is white or is maybe not of that particular culture can write this book that, goes into all these stereotypes, but ends up, making this person rich. I was wondering how much you think that sort of dynamic is still exists, or do you think that that's sort of going to start breaking down a bit more?
See, and that one I think is just a problem with that book. It's a wonderful book, but the problem is that it was marketed really, really problematically. Where it was, what was it? Her husband was an immigrant, and although she isn't, she knows these experiences, and it turns out her husband was like an Irish immigrant. So it was just really tone deaf, and that was the issue, is that they marketed it badly. So I don't know. I mean, I think it feels to me like a good book, people love to read good books. And if what you want to have it is a really good read, and it would be great if you can check these other boxes. But I think the book would have gone for a lot of money no matter what. But that didn't mean to me it should have been promoted and marketed the way it did. And so there's now all the major publishers have gotten, and Sonali can talk about this too, is there's different people that are now reading for sensitivity, or to make sure that other voices are really being represented properly. So everybody got very careful about it. So in a lot of ways, I think American Dirt, that controversy is great, because it makes everybody have to line up better.
Yeah, I would also just kind of add to that. I think people recognize sort of some of the problems with the content and with representation. And I think, one of the things that we're sort of hopeful about, and that controversy doesn't exist in a vacuum. I think it kind of, especially given everything that's gone on these past few months, which is, something that I'll talk about more as well. But I think really recognizing that sort of, the pipeline through which that book went through in order to be created, it was, the editors were white, kind of everybody doing reads and edits on it was also white. So not having those outside perspectives, I think, really made a big difference to sort of how it came together, why people thought it was okay to do that, and why they sent it out. And I would say, a couple of the things that we're seeing in response to that is, one, just more of that awareness of how, and I think it goes a little bit too to the question of what Aaron was asking as well, and sort of what we're seeing is that I think a big problem that people are starting to recognize is that for a long time they were suggesting that books by people of color or other marginalized backgrounds, that there somehow wasn't an audience for them, that nobody was interested in reading them, or that, whatever it is, Latino people don't read, or something like that, right? And so when you have a book that was written by a white person, it felt like, oh, somehow it just kind of makes it palatable, like, oh, well, we see the audience for this, and we feel like we could sell this. And I think, it comes from having that, again, the entire kind of pipeline being sort of, uniform. And so I think what we're hopefully seeing, and again, something that, we can talk about too, was we had like the publishing paid me hashtag that came out earlier in the summer. And I think that too highlighted a lot of the discrepancies that you're talking about, where people realized it was, a lot of white authors being paid really high advances, and people of color, and, big names too, like Roxane Gay and Jessamine Ward, being, very vastly underpaid for their titles. So I think it's something that is in the consciousness now, way more than it was before. And I think, even more so than American Dirt, I think what kind of happened over the summer, and what's, the result of like the publishing paid me hashtag in particular, I think that's illuminated it. And I think that has made people really kind of like, oh shit, like we really need to deal with this, and we really need to kind of figure out a way through it, and a way that's not suggesting that, that certain voices, or voices that were valid before, are no longer valid now, and now it's all the voices that were invalid are suddenly very valid. Like I think it's just, it's going to be messy and it's going to get weird, but hopefully it kind of, takes us in a more positive direction. Are there any other questions, or should I just keep rambling about some of the other stuff that I was going to talk about? Okay. So where I was going to kind of start the conversation, I think, so one of the things that came out, and I was just sort of speaking more about kind of diversity and inclusion, because I do think it is such a big conversation in publishing. And I think regardless of whether you are
an author or somebody working in publishing, it's really important to be aware of it, to be aware of the fact that people are talking about this, how they're talking about it, and sort of, you know, what are the things that might lead you to put your foot in it. And so, you know, where we started this year in January, which feels like so long ago, but it ended up being a drop in the ocean, and people were hoping that it would have been a bigger thing. But this company called Lee and Low, which is a publisher of, you know, they focus on multicultural books and primarily in the children's space. They ran this diversity survey. They had done the first one in 2015, and this one was the second one coming 5 years later. And basically what their survey figured out is that nothing had changed across the last 5 years. 5 years ago, publishing was about 75% white, and now it's still about 70% white or 75% white. So I think it was frustrating for a lot of people who had been kind of engaged in these diversity and inclusion conversations for the last 5 years. What the first survey did was it really gave us, you know, a way in kind of hard and fast numbers to say, here is this problem in the industry, like, don't believe me, look at the numbers, and you can kind of see what it is. And there were a lot of good things that happened. Like the last 5 years, we saw, you know, the rise of the Own Voices hashtag, which is, I think, taken especially the children's publishing world by storm, but we're kind of seeing it transcend in sort of the adult fiction space and even some of the nonfiction space as well. You also had the creation of things like DV Pit, which is, you know, an online pitch session sort of aimed at diverse voices. So it was a little bit frustrating, I think, for people to see all of these things that felt like really great strides, and for that to not actually translate into any kind of systemic change within the industry and within the makeup of the industry. And that's sort of, you know, the pathway that gets you to American Dirt and to other titles that have been kind of, you know, called out in different ways. But then we have these two kind of big seismic events that sort of shake everything up all at once. The first is the pandemic, which I think really, you know, everybody going remote, it was kind of the first way and sort of one way for people to really recognize, like, you know, when all publishers sort of, you know, closed down their offices at the beginning of March. I remember so many of the early conversations just being like, how is it going? Are you guys set up okay? Do you feel like you're doing it well? And I think, you know, essentially it went off without a hitch, which sort of showed everyone like, oh, hey, publishing doesn't need to be centered in New York. Like, people can work remotely. We can do these jobs remotely. And I think that traditionally has been sort of the biggest barrier to entry to having a more diverse workplace and a more diverse workforce, because I don't know if you're aware, but New York is very expensive. And publishing, you might have heard, is a notoriously low-paying industry, and especially at the entry level. So being able to kind of see like, okay, we can have people working remotely, like books still get published. As Jeff kind of said, you know, the book industry is still thriving. It's still doing well. So I think that was really eye-opening for people. And then, you know, the other, George Floyd's murder and those protests that kind of crept up out of it. I think we saw, you know, explosive conversations kind of across the country as a whole, but translating into, you know, each and every industry. And in publishing, that was sort of the thing that prompted, you know, the Publishing Paid Me hashtag. We saw a lot of BIPOC authors and colleagues coming out to kind of talk about their experiences, to talk about really troubling experiences that they had in getting their book published, or, you know, just kind of within their workplaces. And I think, you know, now it's sort of prompting people to like, if the Lee and Low survey just sort of laid out in the numbers, like, these are the things that we find, you know, this is the problem, it exists. I think all of the conversations that came out just allowed us to kind of illustrate it in a different way and to drive it home and for it to register, I think, in a way that it never quite has before. So I feel like we're at a place where, you know, the cynic in me is still alive, like still kind of wondering, fearing what's going to happen. Are these conversations going to stop? but I think there are a lot of positive changes that are coming out of it. We're seeing, you know, entry-level salaries are starting to go up, which is a huge thing. We're hopefully also going to see, you know, more kind of positions opening up, being able to stay open in a remote capacity, which would be very exciting. I think the other kind of big and exciting thing too is, so, you know, traditionally, if a publisher or somebody has kind of wanted to increase diversity in their workplace, it's that sort of same 25% of people within publishing who are just getting shuffled around to different companies. But I think bringing in people from outside who feel like, you know, they can do the job. So bringing in Dana Kennedy and Lisa Lucas, who, you know, still within kind of the larger literary sphere, but, you know, not editors, not people just moving from, you know, shop A to shop B. So I think that's kind of where we are. It's sort of, you know, change is slow. It's going to be messy. It's going to get uncomfortable and weird. But I think, you know, the awareness that we're seeing now, and I think also there's a sense of allyship that I feel like never quite existed before. A lot of times, if you were a BIPOC person advocating for change, it was you and your other BIPOC friends. I feel like now there is kind of, you know, especially I would say I feel it amongst kind of the younger assistants and associates, you know, across the publishing industry, just really, really like galvanized in a way that I don't think they've been before. So that's me. Any questions? I'm going to the chat. No questions.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how audio has changed. Mostly, especially in the last couple of years. The first thing I really wanted to talk about is audio originals. When we say audio originals, we mean an audio work that doesn't really have a text basis. So like, for example, it's kind of more of a free-flowing, like podcast sort of recording. Jeff, he's had a lot of country music artists who have been interested in doing something like this because they have that voice. You know, they're known for their voice. They often go on the radio and talk. That's kind of how their fan base knows them. So they're very interested in kind of seeing what they can do in that space that's different and, you know, maybe a little bit more lucrative than the podcast space. And the audio originals have been kind of an interesting way of doing that. It also translates a little bit to fiction too, because often we'll have agents submit fiction projects. Let's say they don't get traction for whatever reason with print publishers. There are a couple of independent audio publishers that will consider it as an audio original. So taking it on, publishing it first as audio, and really marketing it that way before it actually comes out in print. Audible's really at the forefront of doing that, but Recorded Books, which is another independent audio publisher, and Dreamscape, which to a lesser extent, they're all kind of trying to pursue projects and kind of just expand how they're thinking about audio, because technology just has increased so much in the last even 10 years. And we've just seen so much increase in the people who want to listen to audiobooks. I think the numbers as of 2018 was audio had increased by 28% over ebooks. And part of that reason was because a lot of audio publishers are acquiring a bunch of backlist titles. So this actually happened with ebook a while back when ebook started becoming kind of like more of a thing. The publishers would try to publish print books that had never been published in ebook into that format. So the same kind of thing happened with audio when people really started listening to audiobooks. They started seeing, hey, there's this book in the 1970s that was a classic and it's never been made into audio. Like, we should get on that, right? So there was just this big increase of trying to buy up audio rights, which is just, it's really been cool to see. And the advanced levels have been going up and things because of that, which is nice for the authors. But as for the audio originals, another thing I wanted to mention with that, especially with country music artists and even sometimes fiction, there's just so much innovation that can go on there. We're seeing them kind of delve into music a little bit, which has been fascinating to see. Because if you think about it, you really got to go and drill into those permissions for that music. And who do I go to in order to use Dolly Parton's X song? Maybe it's Dolly Parton, but she owns 95%. Who owns the other 5%, right? So they've had to kind of like think their way through those questions and figure out how to license music and how to work with some of the major music people in the industry to kind of like get those fees down. So music is another way that it's expanding, and really originals have opened the door for that expansion and innovation. And just free flow talk, which is never anything that you would think about with publishing, right? You always think about written word. Another thing kind of in the same vein as originals is what Audible is doing, specifically Audible with short works. So Audible started this new initiative last year where they wanted to start acquiring short stories or short essays from authors while they were waiting for their books to come out. They're really marketing it as a way of promoting your book before, in that time between when you're kind of waiting for it to come out. And they're starting to publish stories as short as 5,000 words. So it's something really, really short. It can go up to like 20,000 words, but they're paying a lot. Like the fees that they're offering are pretty substantial, considering them against like first serial rights, for example. It's been really surprising to see what they're able to do there. And they're not even really, the reason why they're fees is they're not even really selling them like you would think a traditional audiobook. They're making them available on their membership program. So if you have an Audible subscription, you can go on and listen to certain short works for free. And of course, there's no way that they're like really keeping track of those listens, so you can't really like figure out how to do the royalties for that. So that's where they work in the fee situation. But you know, before this, they always said that they needed books to be at least 50,000 words or 70,000 words in order to make an audiobook. And now they're just seeing a lot of change there. They're seeing that they can be as short as 5,000 words, and people are hungry for that material and they'll listen to it while they're on the way to work in the subway. And it has just been kind of cool to see. I think another thing one last thing I wanted to talk about audio, because it really is changing so much. Actually, one more thing with the short works. We're also selling these short works as series, which has been fun. So like, let's say we have an author, a nonfiction author, who has this series idea, but it's not like, they don't want to do these segments in full length works. They want to do them in short like bursts, kind of like a class, if you would think kind of like that way. We've been seeing some success in like submitting those ideas as a series, and Audible is like packaging them together and releasing them as short works. So that's been really cool as well. Does anyone have any questions about that? Anything about audio that I just talked about? Yes, Jeff Kleinman.
So I'll just chime in to just say, I think I'm hoping you're hearing that publishing is just going in all sorts of different directions and creativity has never been as high. So it really is cool to be thinking about that there's all sorts of options that people didn't used to have before. The one caveat I'd say is that you still more or less want it to fit into some kind of a niche. Like you don't want it to be something that I wouldn't know what to do with, a performance cookbook, poetry, flame throwing exercise. Like it has to be a book of some sort. So even if it's going to be a free form, more of a podcast, you still want some kind of a structure. You still want some kind of touchstones to make it make sense. Just hearing your dog bark for 2 hours is not going to get a publishing deal.
Are you serious, Jeff? Dang, there goes.
He has a cat named June, and June will get a pub deal without any question.
Okay, good. The last thing I kind of want to just touch on and mention in audio, because it was something that I recently learned I didn't know, was that graphic novel rights, they're being adapted into audio more and more, which is not something that would happen before. And when you think about graphic novel rights, you think heavy heavily illustrated. How does that translate to audio? Are they going to read the photo, or like how do they kind of translate that artwork? Personally, I haven't listened to a graphic novel on audio form yet, but a lot of the publishing companies are really looking for content in that space, and the children's space. They're doing a lot of picture books, a lot of middle grade and YA, which never, they would get sold as audio, but it wasn't as competitive as it is now. So that's kind of been interesting to see just how across the board audio has been expanding in the last couple of years. And that was the last thing I really wanted to mention there about how audio has changed. Anyone have any other questions for me or for, okay, Rita?
I have a question, which is, if you're selling kind of sections of a book, or you're doing that serialization of a book, does that usually happen once a book is under contract, like say for publication 8 months from now or a year from now, or can you do it if you're building a manuscript? Like where does one go with that?
You mean for the short works? You can do it at any time. They mostly suggest doing it in the between stages of submitting your work, like after you have a book deal, because there's that draw of, you're gearing up for the publication, the book launches around the corner, and you want to like really connect with a new audience of people. Hey, here's this audiobook audience that you might not have connected with before. But they're buying short works for authors that don't have anything coming up. We just did a deal with Adam Wilson. His book just came out, and that short story is going to be publishing relatively soon after it published. So it's really, I think one of the reasons why they pushed hard to make us kind of comfortable with the idea of short works by saying it was a way of keeping the author kind of in the limelight is because it's not an advance, it's a fee. And there's this 12-month holdback for print and ebook rights. You don't get royalties. They don't offer a bonus structure. There's a lot about the deal that feels kind of scary because it's not like you usually see audiobook deals go for. It's like the advance, a typical kind of deal structure. But the fees have been competitive. So that's kind of a big draw there. But I hope that answers your question.
And I think it's good because a lot of people here are students, and you have to keep in mind we're in sort of a different place than I think a lot of times writers are. You guys just want to get your work out there, and we want to build a career. So it's not like there's a problem because both things normally work together. You want to get your things out there so you can build a career, but a lot of times people will want to just sort of throw things at the wall. Well, I wrote this poem, so can you do an audio original? And then I wrote a graphic, I went to a graphic novel or a children's book or something. Can you do this? And our job is to try to focus you and try to figure out what to do next that is the smartest thing for your career. So that's kind of it's a different disconnect. So it may be, Rita, that you have 30 different essays. Should we do something with this? And the answer to me would be, well, do you have a deal? Once you have those essays, what are we going to do with them? Like, it's nice that you have them done and they're on audio, but are we gonna try to use those to develop an audience? So we have a mailing list that we have like 200,000 people on a mailing list that are going to be interested in this book. Like that feels, then maybe what we need to do is have a book deal first. So then we know how the book is going to be positioned. So then we can then take those audio book pieces and, your flame throwing dog barking essay that you want to do, it really doesn't fit in with the book, Rita. It's nice that you wrote it. Go, wait for the next book, but that's not what we're going to focus on right now. So there's do you see the tension? And that's a lot of times what we do as agents is we try to wow, Nina's putting on a mask. Yike. There she goes. So anyway, there's a little bit of a tension there.
Well, thank you, Jeff, Kat, and Sonali for the insights into the publishing industry. We're at about 10 minutes till the hour and thought it would be a great time to open it back up for questions to all of the presenters here, so that if folks had questions for Shawn or for Miciah about their novels in progress, that you'd have the opportunity to ask those questions. So feel free to drop them in the chat or to unmute yourself.
That was a really interesting discussion about publishing world. you know, from my point of view. And all that stuff from Katherine about audio and short things are completely new to me. So thank you for that. That was really very instructive, even for old guy like me. I've had the same agent since 1978. So I kind of grew up in the industry with her. Her name's Barbara Lowenstein, and been around forever. And I was one of her first clients when she was an office of one. So it's been interesting really to see the world of literary agencies, you know, through her eyes, and how publishing has changed, you know, over many decades now. But I do agree with what Jeff says, you know, that literary agencies try to build careers, and it's never been as true as it is with my relationship with Barbara. That's what she's interested in, is not the first book, but the next one, and the next one after that, and the next one after that, right? You know, so she takes on clients. I've tried to give her clients where they already have a book contract in hand, and she looks at it and she goes, no. You know, I'm not interested in that person's career, you know, even though they have a contract, and all she has to do is read it and get her percentage. But she, you know, she has to believe in what you're doing in order to become her client, you know. And I personally, I think I'm her charity case, you know. She has high revenue clients that paid for her Park Avenue penthouse. And I always say that I paid for the doorknob on that place. But she loves me. And I'm too afraid to leave her ever. So if you know her, no one leaves her. When I tell publisher who my agent is, they turn pale. It's like, oh no, we don't. Oh no, really? That's your agent? All right. So anyway, that was really a great presentation. I learned a lot. Sitting on my side of the table as a writer.
Shawn, I would actually love to ask you a question. I followed pretty closely kind of the developments with No Boy and the company,
Yeah.
and know very much about your history as an activist as it converges with your creative practice. And I don't know that everybody in the room here does know about, kind of you taking on big publishing. And I think that would be a really powerful story to share.
Yeah, just to make a very long story short, last year, I discovered that Penguin Classics had reissued No Boy by John Okada. And it's an unauthorized publication of No Boy. I had originally republished it back in the 1970s by myself when no one would publish the book or reissue it. It had originally come out in 1957 by Charles Tuttle. And when I discovered it, it was out of print, and I tried to get publisher after publisher to reprint it, and no one would reprint it. And finally, I published it myself in my 20s, and then sold it to the University of Washington Press a couple of years later. And Penguin came out. Penguin thought the book was in the public domain. And I go, no, it's not, because I have the copyright in my hand that I got from the Library of Congress. And so last May, I started a social media shaming campaign, and Penguin fought me. I'm an author. I'm taking on the largest publisher in the world. And to make a long story short, I discovered that social media is an amazing weapon. You don't have to have a lawyer. All you need is social media. And I went on Facebook and I posted my outrage that Penguin had not contacted the Okada family, bypassed them, not paying royalties to them, And I just went off the deep end on social media. And 2 days later, the New York Times calls me, and Alexandra Alter, and she interviewed me for 2 hours. And at the end of 2 hours, she says, I'm sending a photographer over to your house. And she goes, this is a great David versus Goliath story. Little English professor in Seattle takes on penguin. and there was one funny thing that happened. So I went on this campaign, and then once the New York Times picked it up, everybody picked it up. CBS News, you know, the Washington Post, the LA Times, the Seattle Times put it on the front page. And copyright attorneys were hired. And one copyright attorney that was hired said, well, Penguin might have a case here because you filled out the copyright form. You didn't, it's debatable whether you filled out the copyright form correctly or not, right? And I said, oh no, you know, and then when the New York Times article came out, this copyright attorney contacted our copyright attorney, and her name was Jane Ginsburg. And she's an international copyright attorney, law professor at Columbia University, and she happens to be the daughter of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And she called the University of Washington Press, and she goes, you know, you might have a case here because this copyright case is really fascinating. You know, it involves international copyright. It involves a whole host of things that only copyright attorneys can appreciate. And she goes, this is an extremely complex case, but it's so interesting. If you can prove one thing, which is the book was originally published in Japan, she said, there's this little law. If it did not go on sale in America for 30 days or more after it had been published in Japan, the copyright is still in force. Can you prove that? I said, we can prove that in 1 minute. We had the documentation to show that it hadn't gone on sale in America for more than 30 days. And then, and she goes, well, then the copyright is still in force, and Penguin violated the copyright. And then when we notified, it was never in the press, when we notified that Jane Ginsburg was involved, Penguin gave up. They go, all right, we give up. we don't want this in the news now. And they withdrew all the copies they had published and from the US market. And I told my agent, I said, I don't know if that was a good professional move on my part, but I was outraged. and then later in Seattle, I actually, Elda Roeder, the executive director of Penguin Classics, was coming to Seattle for a convention. And so we agreed to meet. And you know, the case had already been settled. And we agreed to meet, and we had a really nice meeting. You know, I said, let's bury the hatchet. I did what I had to do. And she goes, no, you're right. You know, and we hired a outside consultant to look for books that were in the public domain, and he didn't do his homework. But anyway, it was an interesting process. Taking on Penguin Random House, and so the 40-year history of University of Washington Press publishing the book was, you know, saved. They've now sold something like 160,000 copies of No No Boy.
Thank you, Shawn. It's such an important story. Thank you for sharing that. We're a little bit over time, but we do have one question in the chat box from a student, Eli Jacobs. She just has a question on diversity, and I think that probably any of you all could respond to this. Her question is, how do I present diverse stories without making the selling point the diversity rather than the story?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. And also for Shawn, what a great story. That's so incredible. But yeah, and anyways, Eli's question, I would say, so one, I think that's a really smart and valid question, because I think there has been kind of a tendency in the industry to sort of pigeonhole people and say that if you are a diverse writer writing a certain story, that, you know, it has to be this kind of thing. And honestly, you know, the couple of things I would say are, one, just to make sure your story itself is as strong as possible. I think sometimes, you know, writers who are engaging with those themes, I've sometimes found that the message kind of becomes the story, and that's not always the intention. So one, being kind of mindful of that in terms of the craft of the story itself. And then, you know, when you're reaching out to agents and editors, and when you're having conversations with them, I think it's, you know, do yourself the service of really trying to find somebody who understands what you're going for and who isn't pigeonholing you in that way. I think, you know, there are enough agents out there that it will be possible for you to find the right fit. But I think, you know, just kind of doing yourself that service of, like, if you hear, you know, from that phone call, you're getting the vibe that they kind of want to position this in a way that you're not comfortable with, or that feels like it is going to kind of put you into that box, I think it's totally fair to kind of take that step back and say, that's not what I want, and I don't think you're the right fit for me. And it can be hard, especially if it feels like a phone call is, you know, that phone call is going to be the only phone call. But, you know, I think in the long run, if you're going for somebody who doesn't feel like they're the right fit, like, those are not the agent relationships that tend to last. So, yeah.
Well, thank you, Rita, for letting us do this. This was fun.
Absolutely. It's been an honor to have all of you here tonight. Thank you so much. If everyone would like to unmute for a second and give a hand of applause to all of our writers and agents, that would be lovely. So thank you, Miciah. Thank you, Shawn. Thank you, Sonali. Thank you, Katherine. And thank you, Jeff.